notification came on a Tuesday morning while I was eating cereal over my kitchen sink, still in my scrubs from the night shift. I almost didn't open it. My phone was cluttered with those kinds of alerts, bank offers, app updates, random emails I'd subscribed to years ago and never bothered to unsubscribe from. But something made me set down my spoon and actually look. It was from the estate attorney's office. Subject line regarding the estate of Howard Bellamy. My hands went cold. Uncle Howard had died 6 weeks earlier, quietly, in the assisted living facility outside Knoxville, where he'd spent the last 4 years of his life. He was my father's older brother, the family eccentric, the one nobody talked about much, except to roll their eyes. He'd never married, never had kids, worked most of his life as a civil engineer, and lived below his means so aggressively that my grandmother used to say he was either the cheapest man alive or secretly miserable. Maybe both. I'd visited him twice in that facility. Just me. I'd drive the 2 hours after a shift, bring him a good sandwich from the deli he used to love, and sit with him for a few hours. We'd talk about nothing important. Old movies, whether the Vols had any shot that season, what the nurses were like. He didn't ask for much, he just seemed glad someone came. My mother thought it was a waste of time. "He's not going to remember you visited," she told me once. "He barely remembers your name." He remembered my name just fine, but I didn't argue. So when the email said the attorney needed to schedule a call regarding the distribution of Uncle Howard's estate, I figured it was something small. A piece of furniture he'd wanted me to have, maybe a few $100s. I almost rescheduled twice because my shifts kept running over. I'm glad I didn't. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. A careful, soft-spoken man who sounded like he'd delivered news like this many times before and had learned to be gentle about it. He explained that Uncle Howard had updated his will 18 months before he passed, that he'd liquidated most of his assets quietly over the last few years, his property in Tennessee, a portfolio of index funds he'd been building since the 1980s, a few other accounts. Then he told me the number. I made him repeat it. $2.4 million, left entirely to me. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I didn't plan to. My legs just stopped working. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because people always assume it's pure joy. It wasn't. There was joy, yes, a dizzying, disbelieving kind, but underneath it, almost immediately came something else, something that felt more like fear. Because the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't what will I do with this, it was who was going to find out. I'd grown up in a big, loud, interconnected family. 4 aunts and uncles on my mother's side alone, a grandmother who still hosted Sunday dinners, cousins I'd known my whole life. We were close in the way families can be close when they share holidays and group chats and a general awareness of each other's business. But we were also close in a way I'd started to recognize as something else, a kind of closeness that felt less like love and more like proximity, like being watched. I'd been the responsible one for as long as I could remember. Went to nursing school on loans I was still paying off. Never asked anyone for help. Never missed a bill. Never made a scene. And because of that, because I was steady and quiet and didn't cause problems, I had become, without ever agreeing to it, the family safety net. The one people called when they needed something sorted out. My older brother had borrowed $3,000 from me 3 years ago to cover a gap between jobs. He'd Venmo'd me back $500 7 months later and never mentioned the rest. My mother had asked me to cover her car insurance for 4 months while she got back on her feet after switching jobs. That was 2 years ago. My cousin, her youngest daughter, sweet-faced and completely unconscious of how entitled she sounded, had asked me to co-sign a lease for an apartment she couldn't afford. I'd said no to that one, and she hadn't spoken to me properly since. None of these people were monsters. That's the thing nobody tells you. They weren't evil. They just saw me as a resource before they saw me as a person. And now I was sitting on my kitchen floor with $2.4 million and the absolute certainty that if anyone found out, I would never be seen as a person again. Mr. Calloway walked me through the next steps. I took notes on a paper towel because it was all I had nearby. He recommended I speak with a financial advisor and an estate planning attorney before making any decisions. He mentioned something called a revocable living trust. He said there was no rush, that the funds would remain in a holding account until I was ready. I thanked him and hung up and sat there for a very long time. The first person I called was not a family member. It was a friend from nursing school, the only person I trusted completely, who lived in Portland now and had no connection to anyone I knew back home. I didn't tell her the full number. I just said I'd inherited more than I expected and I was overwhelmed and I didn't know what to do. She said, "Don't tell anyone, not yet. Give yourself time to think." That was the smartest advice anyone gave me. I spent the next 3 weeks doing nothing but research and meetings. I found a fee-only financial advisor through a professional association, someone who charged by the hour and had no incentive to upsell me on anything. Her name was Miss Sade Passanen, and she was the kind of person who spoke in plain language and looked you in the eye and didn't make you feel stupid for not knowing things. She walked me through tax implications, investment strategies, the basics of wealth preservation. She helped me understand what I actually had and what I actually needed to do to protect it. She also said, gently but clearly, that the single most common mistake sudden wealth recipients make is telling people too soon. I set up a trust. I moved the funds. I opened new accounts that weren't connected to anything my family had ever seen. And then I went back to my regular life, my apartment, my shifts, my scrubs, my same beaten-up Honda with the check engine light that had been on for 8 months. Nobody knew anything had changed. But here's where I have to be honest about the part of me that wasn't just cautious. Part of me was also watching. I had been carrying a low, chronic doubt about my family for years. Not dramatic doubt, not the kind that makes you cut people off or have big confrontations. Just a quiet wondering, a background noise. Would these people show up for me if I really needed them? Or have I been quietly, consistently, the one who shows up for everyone else? The money gave me a way to find out. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it a lot, whether what I did was fair. But the truth is, I didn't orchestrate anything elaborate. I just stopped pretending everything was fine and asked for help. It was mid-November when I called my mother. I told her I'd had a rough few months, which was partially true. I'd been dealing with some burnout, and that I was short on rent for December. Just 1 month. Just $900. I said I'd pay her back in January. There was a pause. Then she said, "Honey, you know I would if I could, but your stepdad and I just put down the deposit on the cruise, and we've already paid for the flights, and you know how December is with Christmas shopping." I told her I understood. I did understand. I just needed to hear her say it. I called my brother next. We talked for 20 minutes first. Normal stuff, his job, his girlfriend, a show he was watching. Easy, comfortable conversation. Then I brought it up the same way. Rent. December. $900. He laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. "Man, I wish I could. I literally just had to replace both my front tires. This month has been brutal." He'd texted me 2 days earlier about a weekend trip he was planning with his friends to Nashville. I didn't mention that. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, the one who'd always presented herself as the practical, no-nonsense one in the family, actually met me for coffee before she gave me her answer. She drove 20 minutes, let me buy her a latte, and spent 45 minutes telling me about the importance of financial discipline and how she'd had to learn hard lessons in her 20s, and she really thought it would be good for me to talk to a financial advisor. I almost laughed. I was paying a financial advisor by then. She left without offering a dime, but she did send me an article later that week about budgeting apps. My cousin, the one who hadn't spoken to me properly since the cosign, texted back a single line, "I'm really tight right now too, sorry." No call, no follow-up. She'd posted a photo the same day of a new sectional sofa she'd just gotten delivered. One by one, each conversation a little different in its texture, a little different in its excuse, some warmer, some cooler, but all the same at the center. Not one of them asked me if I was okay. Not one of them said, "I can't do the full amount, but can I help a little?" Not one of them said, "Let me see what I can figure out." Not one of them just sat with the discomfort of not being able to help and stayed on the phone anyway. They answered the logistical question and closed the door. The only exception was my grandmother's younger sister, a woman in her early 70s who lived alone in a small house in rural Virginia on a fixed income whose husband had passed 4 years ago. She was on the edge of the family in the way that some people are, present enough to be included but not close enough to be central. I almost didn't call her. I wasn't sure it was fair to ask her. But something made me. She picked up on the second ring. I explained the same thing I'd explained to everyone else. Rent, December, $900. I pay it back in January. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you manage if I send you $500 now and the other $400 after my Social Security comes in on the 1st? I had to put the phone down for a second. I told her that wasn't necessary, that I'd figure it out. She said, "You wouldn't have called me if you'd figured it out. Don't be stubborn." Then she said something that I still think about. She said, "Your Uncle Howard talked about you, you know. He said you were the one who actually showed up. I always thought that said something about you." I cried after I hung up. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that comes when something you suspected turns out to be true, and the truth is both a relief and a grief at the same time. I didn't let her send the money. I took a week before I did anything. I needed that week just to sit with what I now knew clearly, without any doubt or softening, not as a suspicion anymore, as a fact. Then I started making decisions. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans, all of them in one payment, on a morning when I had a day off and the apartment was quiet. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the balance go to zero and felt something shift in my chest that I can't fully describe, like setting down something I'd been carrying so long I've forgotten it had weight. The second thing I did was put a down payment on a condo, not flashy, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I'd always liked, but never thought I could afford, with a parking spot and good light in the mornings and a building that felt quiet. I paid cash for 40% of it and financed the rest at a rate Ms. Patterson helped me negotiate. I told no one I was moving until I already had the keys. The third thing I did was call my great-aunt back. I told her I'd found a way to manage the rent situation and that she shouldn't worry about the money. She said she was glad. We talked for an hour about nothing much, her garden, a book she was reading, whether the weather in Virginia was getting stranger every year. At the end of the call, I told her I'd been thinking about her roof. She mentioned once, offhandedly, that there was a section that needed work before winter. I told her I wanted to take care of it. She started to argue. I told her Uncle Howard would have wanted it. That stopped her. I hired a contractor. They fixed the roof and replaced 2 windows that had been drafty for years. Total cost was less than what I'd spent worrying about my family over the past decade. Then I did the harder thing. I started being honest. Not in a dramatic confrontation way, not with speeches or ultimatums, just in the quiet, steady way of no longer pretending. I stopped being available for every ask. I stopped softening my no. I started responding to the group chat less, declining invitations that I'd previously forced myself to attend, letting calls go to voicemail when I needed to. What surprised me was how few people noticed, or how few said anything anyway. My brother texted once asking if I was okay because I'd been quiet lately. I said I was fine and busy. He sent a thumbs up and that was that. My mother noticed more. She brought it up over the phone in December, said I seemed distant, said she felt like something was wrong. I told her, as gently as I could, that I'd been doing some thinking about the dynamics in our family, and that I needed some space. She was hurt. I expected that. She said she didn't know what she'd done. I told her it wasn't about any one thing. That conversation was hard. We're still finding our way back to something, my mother and I. She loves me. I don't doubt that. But love isn't always the same as showing up, and I'd confused those two things for a long time. By February, I'd mostly stopped attending Sunday dinners. Nobody reached out to ask why except my grandmother, my actual grandmother, who called me one evening and said simply, "I don't know what's going on, but I miss you and I'd like to see you." I went to see her the following weekend, just the 2 of us, lunch at her house, the same kitchen where I'd learned to make pie crust when I was 9. She didn't push or ask questions. She just fed me and sat with me and let it be easy. I don't know if I'll ever tell my family about the inheritance. Some days I think I should, that carrying a secret this size for the rest of my life would be its own kind of weight. Other days I think the secret isn't really the point. What I know now doesn't need to be announced. Last spring, I took my great-aunt on a trip to Savannah. She'd never been. We spent 3 days walking around and eating too much and sitting on the hotel balcony in the evenings, watching the street below. On the second night, she said, out of nowhere, "You know, I wasn't sure about you when you were small. You were so quiet. I thought maybe you were unhappy." She laughed. "But you were just thinking." "Still am," I told her. She patted my hand and we sat there in the warm Georgia evening, and I thought about Uncle Howard eating his sandwich in that facility, content to be remembered by one person who actually showed up. I thought about how he'd spent his whole life building something quietly, and then left it to the one person who'd come and sat with him for no reason, other than that it seemed like the right thing to do. I had been so afraid of what the money would change. And it did change things, just not in the way I expected. It didn't change who loved me. It just showed me what had been true all along. I'm still a nurse. I still do night shifts. I still drive to work before sunrise, and drink bad coffee from the break room, and come home tired in a way that's also somehow satisfying. My life doesn't look different from the outside. But I knew what's underneath it now. And for the first time in a long time, when I wake up in that condo with the good morning light, I feel like the ground is solid. That's not nothing. Some days, it's everything. I think about my great-aunt a lot, about the way she didn't hesitate, about how she asked if she could split the payment in two, not because she was stalling, but because that was genuinely the most she could do, and she wanted to do it anyway. She didn't have much. She knew she didn't have much, and she offered what she had without making it a performance. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The people who had the most to give made the least effort, and the one person with every reason to say no was the only one who said yes. I used to think that was just luck, that I happened to have one decent person in an otherwise indifferent family. But I don't think that anymore. I think what happened was cause and effect, playing out slowly over years before I ever opened that email. My great-aunt had lived her whole life with that kind of character, the kind that shows up quietly, without applause, without expectation, and Uncle Howard had lived his the same way. He built something real over decades, not because he was chasing a reward, but because he understood what steady, honest living actually looks like. When it came time for him to decide who had been paying attention, who had actually shown up, the answer was obvious to him. It had been obvious for a long time. I was the beneficiary of his clarity, and I think, in a smaller way, I became the beneficiary of my own. Because here's what I've had to reckon with honestly. I spent years being available in ways that cost me, without ever asking whether that availability was being matched. That's not a virtue. That's a habit dressed up as one. Real integrity, the kind that actually holds, means knowing your own worth clearly enough that you don't keep offering it to people who've shown you, repeatedly, that they won't protect it. It took me a long time to understand that self-respect isn't selfishness. It's just honesty about what's real. The harder part was the thinking it required, not just feeling hurt, which was easy, but actually sitting with what I knew and asking myself difficult questions. Were these people malicious? No. Did they love me in some form? Probably. But love without effort isn't a foundation. It's a feeling that shows up when it's convenient and disappears when it isn't. I had to be honest enough and clear-headed enough to stop calling that love and start calling it what it actually was. And then I had to keep going anyway. That's the part nobody talks about. The inheritance didn't save me from having to do the hard internal work. It just removed the financial pressure long enough that I could finally see straight. What I did with that clarity was still up to me. The moving, the decisions, the conversations with my mother, the slow and uncomfortable process of rebuilding my life around what was actually true instead of what was comfortable. That took something I had to find in myself. Nobody handed me that. Uncle Howard ate sandwiches in a facility outside Knoxville and was glad someone came. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need an audience. He just lived according to what he believed was right and trusted that it would mean something eventually. I think about that on the hard days. I think about the morning light in my condo and my great aunt in her garden in Virginia with a repaired roof over her head and the zero balance on my loan account, and the way it feels to finally be standing on ground that's actually solid. That's what he left me, not just the money, the example.